In the quiet, church-going town of Decatur, Alabama, Dr. Hannah Mann was a respected chiropractor, a pillar of his community. He and his wife Hannah were raising two beautiful children in a home that looked like a postcard. To everyone who knew them, they weren't just a happy family, they were the portrait of the American dream. But behind the closed doors of their pristine home, that dream was becoming a living nightmare. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Hannah began to fade. The vibrant young mother grew frail, isolated, a ghost in her own life. Friends and neighbors saw a devoted husband caring for his sick wife. They didn't see the control, the isolation, or the chilling truth of what was causing her decline. By the time she was rushed to the hospital, doctors were baffled. They saw a body shutting down, ravaged by an invisible enemy they couldn't diagnose. They searched for a rare disease, a hidden infection, a logical answer, but the cause wasn't in any medical textbook. It was a secret, meticulously planned and delivered with a smile, and the only person who held the key to this horrifying mystery was the man sleeping beside her every night. Welcome to Beyond the Crime. We go deeper than the headlines to uncover the stories that last a lifetime. If you believe in this mission, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Yet inside the marriage, the dynamics were more rigid than they appeared. Brian took control of many domestic decisions and gradually cut off his wife's connections to the outside world. After the wedding, Hannah's meetups with friends became rare, often postponed or dismissed as inconvenient, a bad time, or no one to watch the kids. She dropped social media and was eventually locked out of her accounts. Brian claimed it was for the family's privacy and safety. He held access to their shared email and passwords. He also handled virtually all the household administration, managing subscriptions, paying bills, and scheduling appointments. Hannah's days were devoted entirely to her home. Mornings started with preparing everyone else. Her afternoons were consumed by errands, cooking, and laundry, and evenings were adjusted to the children's routines. She rarely visited the clinic and only when absolutely necessary. Brian reassured others, and probably himself, that everything was under control. He suggested his medical experience helped at home too, offering advice on well-being, sleep schedules, vitamins, and nutrition. To those around them, it looked like he was deeply engaged in family life. Family photo albums and holiday snapshots painted a picture of harmony. Smiling faces, shared vacations, and captions that felt just right. That's how the story began. An appearance of well-being, a neatly structured daily life, increasing control within the household, and a gradual disappearance of any personal space Hannah once had. In mid-2021, a change occurred in the Mann household, one that, at first glance, didn't raise any red flags. Brian, leveraging his role as a healthcare professional, one day suggested that Hannah start taking a daily vitamin regimen. He explained that the formula was specifically designed to support her system, especially since she spent so much time caring for their little ones and rarely had time to rest. According to him, the supplements came directly from his clinic, which supposedly ensured their quality and safety. The supplements were chewable gummies and powdered mixes to be dissolved in water. For Hannah, who was used to trusting her husband's professional advice, it all seemed like a standard wellness measure. Taking the supplements quickly became routine. Each evening, Brian would personally bring them to the bedroom, setting them on the nightstand along with a glass of water. If she forgot, he would gently remind her, emphasizing the importance of consistency and assuring her that the benefits would only come with regular use. His persistence came off as care and responsibility. Within a couple of weeks, Hannah began to notice subtle changes in how she felt. It started with mild fatigue and dizziness, which she attributed to the usual household workload and constant care of her son and daughter. Over time, the symptoms grew. Back and abdominal discomfort became more frequent. Her eating habits hadn't changed, yet she was losing weight. By the end of summer, she realized her clothes were hanging loose, though she hadn't been trying to slim down. Brian remained calm in the face of these changes. He told her that her body was simply adjusting to the enhanced nutrition, assuring her that temporary side effects were completely normal and that she would feel stronger than ever within a few months. He said it with absolute confidence, referencing his medical background. Hannah didn't feel alarmed. The progression of symptoms was gradual and lacked any sudden crises. Occasional improvements gave her false hope that she was recovering. Still, her energy continued to fade and the number on the scale kept dropping. It was during this period that the foundation was laid for what would soon become a serious and dangerous health condition. By late summer 2021, Hannah's condition began to deteriorate more noticeably. Nausea crept in, making it harder to eat regularly. Between September 2021 and January 2022, she lost nearly 40 pounds, reaching a weight of around 84 pounds. Everyday household tasks started to leave her winded and weak. Standing in the kitchen for extended periods became difficult. She felt dizzy and experienced lower back pain. Climbing stairs left her exhausted. Eventually, Hannah found it hard to stay balanced on her feet and started using a rolling office chair to move around the house, trying to reduce the strain on her legs and avoid falls. Nighttime muscle cramps became more frequent and her sleep turned shallow and restless. Despite Hannah's declining condition, Brian Mann discouraged her from visiting any medical clinics. He insisted he could personally manage her routine, suggesting the right balance of rest and recovery. He repeated phrases like the stress of parenting, seasonal fatigue, and lack of sleep, framing her symptoms as easily explained and not requiring professional evaluation. Alongside his pushback against outside medical help, Brian gradually increased his control over the home environment. He began deciding when Hannah should rest, consistently reminded her to take the supplements he had provided, and brought her water himself, ensuring she followed his schedule. He recommended at-home remedies, lying down more often, staying hydrated, and doing light stretches, which he demonstrated as safe and effective. In conversations, his tone remained soft and attentive, creating the impression of care. By late fall, fatigue had overtaken all her other symptoms. It became harder for Hannah to lift her son and daughter. She often had to ask them to wait while she sat down to catch her breath. Everyday tasks had to be spaced out. Simple chores took hours. By December, the contrast between her appearance and her internal state became too obvious to ignore. Her clothes hung loosely, her face appeared sunken, but her body temperature remained normal, which made things even more confusing. Hannah felt herself deteriorating but couldn't make sense of it. Her diet hadn't changed and her workload hadn't increased. By early January 2022, her condition had reached a critical point. She experienced sudden weakness when standing up, and her vision would blur temporarily. She struggled to eat, sometimes repulsed by food, sometimes nauseated after just a few bites. Moving around the house without support became dangerous. Hannah increasingly relied on the rolling office chair just to get from room to room. Yet even with all this, Brian's stance didn't shift. He kept saying the worst is over, that her body just needed more time, and that recovery was on the way. His tone remained calm, his actions consistent. He managed every detail, issued reminders, and spoke with unwavering confidence. By the time Hannah's physical decline became unmistakably life-threatening, it wasn't she who made the decision to seek medical attention. Her mother, who visited occasionally, realized something was terribly wrong and chose to act without involving Brian. Hannah was barely able to walk by then, so her mother helped her get dressed and walked her to the car. On the drive to the hospital, Hannah spoke very little, complaining mostly of abdominal pain and overwhelming weakness. Upon arrival at the emergency room at UAB Hospital, her mother immediately informed staff that her daughter's condition had been deteriorating for months with no medical oversight. Doctors began with basic vitals: weight, blood pressure, temperature, and heart rate. The results confirmed the gravity of the situation. Her body weight was dangerously low, her pulse weak, and her blood pressure unstable. Initially, physicians explored a wide range of possible causes, from chronic conditions to more serious systemic illnesses. Hannah was referred for a comprehensive series of lab tests and diagnostic procedures. Blood tests revealed something alarming. Hannah's lead levels were dangerously high. For context, anything above 10 micrograms per deciliter is considered medically concerning. The numbers in her case indicated an immediate threat to life. Further diagnostics showed signs of internal organ distress, and soon after, she developed acute respiratory failure. Doctors had to place her on a machine to support her lung function. Imaging scans and radiological assessments revealed fine, metallic-like particles dispersed throughout her tissues. These traces were identified as lead deposits that had built up in her body over time, not from a single exposure, but through ongoing, prolonged intake. This chronic pattern of exposure explained why the symptoms had developed gradually without any sudden medical crisis until her condition became critical. Hannah's health deteriorated so rapidly that doctors were forced to induce a medical coma to reduce the strain on her body and prevent permanent damage. Treatment began immediately with chelation therapy, using specific medications to bind the lead and flush it out of her system. The process was slow and required continuous monitoring of her vital signs. Hannah remained hospitalized for nearly 2 months. During that time, the medical team managed to stabilize her breathing, regulate her vitals, and bring her blood lead levels down. However, even at this stage, it was clear that the poisoning had left lasting consequences. The prolonged exposure to such a toxic metal meant full recovery was unlikely. Doctors emphasized that even a 1-day delay could have been fatal. It was her mother's decision to break from the family's established dynamic that ultimately saved Hannah's life, allowing for timely diagnosis and urgent treatment. Once the diagnosis was confirmed, the hospital notified the Morgan County Department of Human Resources, who in turn passed the information to state investigators in Alabama. The case was taken on by specialists in toxic metal exposure. Their first priority was to inspect the Mann family home for any potential sources of environmental lead. The inspection began in the kitchen and bathrooms. Water samples were collected from every faucet, filters were removed and logged, and the condition of the plumbing and dishware used for food and drink was documented. Investigators also gathered paint chips from older surfaces, dust samples, and soil from outside the home. They went through pantry contents, including food items and nutrition products given to the children. Brian Mann cooperated fully. He pointed out the vitamin supplements Hannah had been taking, which came from his clinic. He also suggested that lead exposure might have come from fast food. Investigators noted his statements carefully. However, specialists quickly dismissed the fast food theory. At a blood lead level near 80 micrograms per deciliter, there would have likely been additional cases, yet no other local incidents were reported. Moreover, Brian and the couple's son and daughter showed no signs of lead exposure, casting further doubt on the idea of a shared incidental source. Initial lab tests of the drinking water, paint samples, dust, pantry items, and nutrition products revealed no hazardous levels of lead or any significant anomalies. At this early stage, investigators found no evidence of typical household sources of lead contamination. At the same time, investigators recommended that all household members undergo testing. Brian stated that tests for his son and daughter came back within normal range and that he would complete his own screening later at a separate facility. His delay raised concerns, especially since some tests could have been conducted immediately on site. This was noted for further review. A second inspection of the home was carried out a few days later, this time with experts from the Alabama Department of Public Health. The scope of testing was expanded. Water samples were taken from both initial flows and post-flush points. Dust was collected from various surfaces. Filters were examined. Swabs were gathered from the kitchen sink, kettle, and blender to check for potential leaching of metals. Investigators also requested packaging from the vitamins and powder mixes to identify the manufacturer and batch number. The results of this second round confirmed the initial findings. No systemic environmental source of lead was present in the home. However, the origin and composition of the supplements Hannah had consumed remained unclear, as investigators did not have access to physical samples. Investigators began reconstructing the details of Hannah's daily life by speaking with family members and close contacts. They collected information about who prepared meals and, more critically, when and where she consumed the supplements. Particular attention was given to the frequency and circumstances surrounding their use. According to family statements, Brian consistently reminded Hannah to take the supplements at night, always at home, with water he had placed by the bed in advance. These details laid the groundwork for a working theory of intentional oral exposure. The early stages of the investigation revealed 3 key findings. There was no evidence of lead contamination in the home environment. The restaurant theory was unsupported by any corroborating data, and the circumstances surrounding the supplement intake, especially Brian's direct involvement, required closer examination. This led authorities to shift their focus toward Brian, initiating steps to verify his claims and investigate whether he had any access to lead materials outside the household. Sometime after Hannah's hospitalization, Brian showed up at the hospital claiming that he had conducted a self-examination. He told medical staff that he had used X-ray equipment at his own clinic and had supposedly detected a foreign substance in his body, which he believed could be lead. His story puzzled the medical team. Self-diagnosis using X-rays is highly unorthodox, and using clinical equipment for personal diagnostics is not considered standard practice. Doctors insisted that he undergo a full medical evaluation at the hospital. When Brian realized the tests would be conducted independently, he appeared visibly anxious. The medical team proceeded with the necessary screening and confirmed that lead was indeed present in his system. However, the levels suggested a very recent exposure. The concentration was too low to cause symptoms and did not indicate long-term accumulation. This stood in stark contrast to Hannah's results, which showed clear evidence of prolonged, high-level exposure over several months. Experts reached a clear conclusion. Brian had most likely ingested lead shortly before his hospital visit in an attempt to portray himself as a fellow victim. This could have been an effort to position himself as a concerned spouse trying to investigate the source of the issue. But the timeline of exposure didn't match, and that inconsistency undermined his explanation. Further interviews with acquaintances and co-workers confirmed that during the entire period of Hannah's illness, Brian never showed any symptoms that would be consistent with chronic lead exposure. His physical condition and daily behavior had remained unchanged. For investigators, this became another strong indicator that Hannah's poisoning had not been an accident. It appeared to be deliberate, with no risk posed to the rest of the family. Brian's attempt to portray himself as a victim only deepened investigators' suspicions. Authorities concluded that his actions were likely intended to shift attention away from the central question: how and from where lead had been entering Hannah's body over an extended period. In the summer of 2022, the investigative team received a call from a man who had previously worked as a contractor on a project for Hannah Mann the year before. He explained that, in 2021, he had been hired to install an X-ray room at Brian's clinic. The job involved lining the walls with lead sheets for shielding. After the project was completed, there were leftover materials, several sheets, and scraps of lead. According to the contractor, Brian requested that the unused pieces not be taken away, saying he would handle them himself. At the time, this didn't seem unusual. Brian was the client, the owner of the facility, and the materials had already been paid for. However, after the contractor heard about Hannah Mann's diagnosis, the context of that job took on a new meaning. He reached out to the police and gave an official statement. Investigators cross-referenced this information with the timeline of Hannah's health decline. They discovered that her symptoms had significantly worsened in August 2021, shortly after the clinic renovation was completed. The dates aligned. Brian gained access to lead just before his wife's prolonged illness began. This provided investigators with a documented external source of the toxic metal, something outside the family's home environment. The contractor gave a detailed account of the project from the beginning to final cleanup. He explained that under normal procedures, leftover materials are either returned to the contractor's warehouse or disposed of according to safety guidelines. He clarified that he didn't witness what Brian did with the remaining lead. He had simply handed it over at the clinic owner's request. Investigators obtained documentation from the contractor, the service agreement, work start and completion dates, and a full list of materials delivered. These records confirmed both the timing and presence of lead-based shielding materials. Clinic staff were also interviewed regarding access to the work area and how leftover construction items were stored. According to their testimony, only Brian had keys to the X-ray room, and post-installation cleanup was done without the contractor's involvement. This timeline became a crucial piece of the case. In 2021, Brian gained access to a real source of lead. While the contractor's statement didn't clarify how the lead was administered, it provided a concrete answer to where it came from and reinforced the theory of intentional exposure. As the investigation continued, another detail came to light. Hannah Mann had multiple life insurance policies totaling approximately $1.3 million. All the policies listed Brian Mann as both the policyholder and sole beneficiary. The fact that these policies were spread across several different insurance providers made them harder to trace and obscured the full scope of the financial coverage. An analysis of the timeline surrounding the insurance policies revealed that the first policy was taken out in 2020, and Hannah was likely aware of its existence. However, in 2021, around the time her health began to decline, additional policies were added. An attempt to increase the total coverage by another $1.5 million was denied, as the applications were rejected. The timing of the expanded insurance coverage, coinciding with Hannah's declining condition, became a critical element supporting the theory of intent. Of particular interest were the health questionnaires and medical forms required for insurance approval. These documents demanded verification of good health, and a sudden drop in weight could have raised red flags, according to Hannah's own statement. Brian pressured her to wear weighted bands on her ankles during medical weigh-ins in order to conceal the weight loss and create the illusion of physical stability, benefiting the insurance application process. While attending consultations, Brian appeared more focused on the policy limits and conditions than on the actual diagnosis or treatment plan. Medical staff noted that he consistently brought up insurance technicalities as a priority topic. Hannah's insurance forms included electronic signatures, which later became a point of contention. The defense argued that Hannah was aware and involved in the process, but she denied this, stating that her husband had access to some of her digital accounts. For investigators, the content of the forms was less important than the bigger picture: who initiated the applications, who would benefit from the payouts, and how the medical documentation was shaped to meet policy requirements. A review of the family's insurance portfolio revealed a red flag. Brian, as the primary earner, was covered by a relatively modest policy, while Hannah, whose financial contributions were smaller, was insured for significantly larger amounts. In typical cases, higher earners are insured for more. The discrepancy raised concerns, suggesting the potential for financial misconduct. These circumstances pointed to a clear financial motive. Hannah's death would have resulted in substantial payouts to Brian. By the time the case went to trial, both sides had solidified their positions. The prosecution built a coherent theory that Brian Mann had deliberately poisoned Hannah with lead in order to collect insurance benefits. This narrative was supported by medical data, a detailed timeline, and extensive financial records. Prosecutors presented all major evidence to support their claims. The defense strategy focused on undermining the credibility of the evidence and highlighting procedural inconsistencies. They argued there was no direct proof linking Brian to the method by which the lead entered Hannah's system, and pushed the court to dismiss circumstantial evidence as insufficient without indisputable confirmation of how the poisoning occurred. Court proceedings began in June 2025 and moved forward on an expedited schedule. The defense focused heavily on the procedures used to collect and store biological samples. Attorneys pointed out that at times urine had been collected in non-standard containers and processed temporarily outside of laboratory conditions. They also referenced the incomplete effort to chemically match the lead found in Brian's clinic to the lead detected in Hannah's body, and the absence of the original supplement containers. Additionally, the defense introduced alternative theories suggesting the possibility of accidental exposure to the toxic substance. After reviewing both sides, the court ruled the submitted medical and procedural evidence admissible, noting that while certain procedural flaws might affect how jurors evaluate the weight of the evidence, they did not render it invalid. After witness questioning concluded, the defense declined to call any witnesses of their own, stating that the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. In their closing argument, the prosecution walked the jury through the timeline. Brian gained access to lead in 2021. Hannah's condition began to deteriorate shortly thereafter. No lead sources were found in the home. The theory of shared environmental exposure was undermined by the fact that no one else in the household showed signs of contamination. The financial motive was evidenced by the insurance policies and attempts to increase coverage, and Brian's claim of being poisoned himself was debunked by medical analysis. The defense reiterated its central theme that the evidence was circumstantial and that no direct proof had been presented of how the lead entered Hannah's system. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with a verdict guilty of attempted murder. The court immediately ordered Brian Mann to be held without bail, pending sentencing. A sentencing hearing was scheduled for August 27, 2025. The judge outlined the possible penalties for the crime, including life imprisonment, depending on the severity of harm done to the victim and the degree of planning involved. The sentencing hearing took place on August 27, 2025. By that time, the court had already found Brian Mann guilty of attempted murder through the use of toxic substances. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty. Prosecutors emphasized that Brian's actions could not be dismissed as a momentary lapse or a one-time incident. Rather, they represented a calculated multi-stage process that unfolded over several months. During this time, he concealed Hannah's worsening condition from healthcare professionals, delayed her diagnosis, and attempted to construct a false narrative suggesting a shared household source of contamination. The defense requested a sentence that did not include life imprisonment. They pointed to Brian's previously clean record, his standing in the community, his work in the medical field, and the fact that he had provided for his family in the past. They also highlighted that Hannah had survived and continued to receive treatment. Furthermore, they argued that the evidence of intent was not unequivocal and urged the judge to take that into consideration. In delivering the court's reasoning, the judge noted that the totality of the evidence, including medical reports, financial records, witness testimony, and investigative findings, formed a complete and coherent picture of deliberate action. The crime, the judge stated, was prolonged in nature, had caused irreversible harm, and would have lifelong consequences for the victim. In the end, Brian Mann was sentenced to life in prison. The court also ordered restitution for medical expenses and emotional damages to Hannah Mann, with the exact amount to be determined through a separate civil suit. But the sentence didn't return Hannah Mann to her former life. Although her condition had stabilized, the effects of severe lead poisoning proved irreversible. Doctors indicated that neurological impairments, chronic pain, ongoing fatigue, and the need for lifelong blood monitoring would remain part of her reality. Some of her lost motor functions were partially restored, but she still relied on a wheelchair for long distances. Hannah's son and daughter were placed in the care of her relatives. Given the widespread media attention the case received, psychological support became an essential part of their recovery process. In Decatur, the story sparked a strong reaction. Former patients of Brian's clinic were stunned and confused by the outcome. The clinic he once owned was shut down shortly after his arrest. All medical equipment, including the X-ray unit, was seized for forensic testing, and his license was officially revoked. The building was later put up for sale. The insurance companies involved in the case conducted internal audits of policies submitted by Brian. As a result, new risk assessment procedures were implemented, including stricter verification of medical information for high-value policies. For law enforcement, the case set a precedent in using toxicological data to prove intent, even without a recovered delivery method for the substance. Investigators noted that indirect evidence supported by expert analysis and a consistent body of witness testimony was critical in securing the conviction. Hannah Mann publicly thanked the medical staff, investigators, and witnesses, stating that without their efforts, she might not have survived. She didn't speak about future plans, but emphasized her focus on healing and caring for her son and daughter. Her story reminds us that the deepest impacts are felt long after the verdict. That's what we explore here at Beyond the Crime. If you value this storytelling, please like, share, and subscribe for more.